All right, people are joining, I see. All right, I think we can get going. There's still some people joining, and I'm sure they'll be joining as we go along. Welcome to all of you. Hello and welcome, and thanks a lot for joining us. My name is David Clay Large. I'm the co-director of the Austrian Studies program at UC Berkeley, and I'm going to be moderating today's discussion on contemporary developments in the environmental humanities. This panel is part of a larger series called Transatlantic Conversations on Sustainability, organized by the Austrian Studies program here at Berkeley in partnership with our fellow North American Austria centers and the Austrian Embassy in Washington, DC. Our session today will last an hour. We'll have discussion from the panelists for the first half hour or so, and then we'll certainly have some time for questions afterwards. Or you can jump in right in between if you want to do that. Let me say just a bit about the field of environmental humanities and introduce our two panelists before we get going. The two panelists are Dan Philippon, he's from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. And then we have Alexa Weik von Mossner, who is at the University of Klagenfurt in Austria. So again, this is part of the Austrian Studies program, and it would be great to have some ideas from across the pond with respect to our topic. Now, sustainability, this field that we're talking about, is really shaped by fields as diverse as philosophy and anthropology, geography, cultural studies, and more. I mean, it's a very diverse interdisciplinary field. And it asks questions like, how have literature and film and the arts engaged with the issue of sustainability? That's an important part of this. How important is storytelling, right? In imagining and working toward a more sustainable future, which we know we have to do, right? I mean, that's the key issue here. So the conversation today will consider current perspectives on ecocriticism and the environmental humanities through an interdisciplinary and comparative lens. Again, our two panelists, Dan and Alexa. Dan, I'll say a little bit about him first. He studies environmental literature and its relationship to ideas of nature and place. He seeks to understand the rhetorical strategies and practical effects of literary texts and their creators, particularly with regard to the historical roots of our contemporary environmental values. His scholarship is grounded most firmly in the area of literary criticism called ecocriticism, but he's also strongly influenced by current work in environmental history, right? And environmental ethics, a very interesting field, and conservation biology. He teaches a range of courses in Minnesota that concern environmental humanities, literary nonfiction writing, sustainability studies, and has been the past president of the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment. Alexa Weik von Mossner worked for several years in the German film and television industry as a production manager and as a script writer before earning her PhD at the University of California, San Diego, and her habilitation at the University of Klagenfurt, where she now is. She's published widely on cosmopolitanism, effective narratology, and various eco-critical issues in American literature and film. She's the author of Effective Ecologies, Empathy, Emotion, Environmental Narrative, and editor of Moving Environments, Affect, Emotion, Ecology, and Film. So let's turn it over now to our panelists. Dan, you want to start and say a few things about, I don't know, maybe how environmental humanities have approached the idea of sustainability? That's a big question, I know, but that could get us going.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. And just a great big thanks to you, David, to you, Alexa, and to Center for Austrian Studies for hosting us. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's it's great to be able to be in a, sort of a public conversation without having to give a presentation, right? A talk and take Q&A. We can involve the audience as much as possible so that they become not an audience, but co-participants. And that's a real joy. So thanks again.
Thanks for me too at this point.
Absolutely. And I'll say just a few words to get us going and thinking some ideas for thought. One is the way in which sustainability is often framed, which is from the perspective of science and technology. And I am grateful that so much good research is happening in science and technology, and so many new technological developments are enabling us to be more sustainable, whether it's carbon capture technology or any other number of things. But there is a really important role for the humanities to play. And I think that is a big part of where the environmental humanities came from as an interdisciplinary field. If the problems that we are now facing are ones that are problems created not merely by science and technology, but I might even argue mainly by our understanding of ourselves as people, our ideas, our philosophies or lack thereof, our hubris, all the things that make us human and make us differently human is an important part of that. These are questions for the environmental humanities, questions of meaning, questions of purpose, questions of difference, and so on. So the various subfields of the humanities, literature, philosophy, religious studies, history, and so on, have of course addressed issues related to nature and the environment for quite some time. The philosophers seem to have hit the ground running first in the 70s. The historians kind of followed rather quickly on their footsteps in the 80s, and then in the 90s, literature really started to catch up to that. And each of these fields, of course, have long histories before those moments too. And they continue to engage these issues. But one of the things that has been really interesting and heartening to me is the emergence of a very interdisciplinary field known as the environmental humanities in the last 10 to 15 years or so. And by that, I don't mean to say that what is happening in a strictly disciplinary context doesn't continue to be important and be very generative. It does. But at the same time, there has developed, and I think our conversation today is evidence of that, really an international movement of scholars and an international network of researchers and teachers who are sharing ideas, sharing perspectives, sharing literature and terminology that goes beyond the strict disciplinarity. And so many of us would identify ourselves not only with our own disciplines, but with this much larger conversation field area of interest known as the environmental humanities. And as proof of that, we see centers being developed all around the world, which have either environmental humanities in their name or do something recognizably humanistic. We see now there's, I think, 4 different collections that are some version of introduction to the environmental humanities that are out there. And once you start to see that literature develop and those centers develop, you know you have something really meaningful on your hands. And that's, I think, where we are right now. And it's really an exciting time to be doing this work, and exciting not only because it's sort of inherently intellectually exciting, but also to get back to your question about sustainability, I think it also is very productive, and that we won't be able to, I don't like to talk about reaching sustainability because I don't think it's a destination we're ever going to achieve, but I think we will have a more robust process and a more robust ability to engage the kind of solutions we need as a result of this conversation. And like a great example would just simply be that we will not be able to call ourselves sustainable if we're not also engaging with social justice concerns, right? We have to have a society that itself embodies justice if we're also going to have society that is environmentally sustainable. And that's built into our understanding of sustainability as involving economics, as well as questions of equity in terms of environmental concerns. So as a frame, I think it's a super exciting field. I'm privileged to be part of it, and I'm grateful that Alexa could join us to add her perspective.
Yeah, thank you. Dan, I agree with everything you've said so far. I think about the question would the environmental humanities specifically have contributed, in addition to what you've already mentioned, to this idea of sustainability, the concept, the notion of it is maybe a somewhat conflicted relationship to the idea of sustainability, because I guess from the perspective of the environmental humanities, and it's always a bit difficult to frame it like that, because within the environmental humanities, there's so many different disciplines and perspectives and methodologies and research foci, and maybe Dan, we can talk a little bit about that later on as well. So it's always kind of, we're using kind of a general term that is much more complicated. The environmental humanities do not speak with one voice. I think that is really something, and that's good, right? It's a good thing, but it's something to be very much aware of. But I think so one thing that has emerged from the environmental humanities in relation to sustainability is criticism, actually. Criticism of the concept. And not in the sense of, this is a terrible concept and we shouldn't be trying to be more sustainable, obviously, but more like, okay, so who is, sustainable for whom? What is meant to be sustainable for whom? For how long? And Dan already mentioned this issue of justice. So there's already this for whom is already involved in there. So because are we talking about everybody? Are we talking about certain countries, certain classes, certain groups of people? So that is, I think, an important criticism in the sense of, okay, interrogating that concept, because it has been used a lot. It has been picked up, right, by the media, by politicians, by the industry. Some would argue it has been co-opted as well, and something we could call greenwashing. Like it feels like everybody is sustainable these days or striving to be sustainable. And so I think that is one thing that the environmental humanities are interrogating. Like, what does this mean? Where does this concept come from? Going back to Brundtland, so going back, to the history of it. And if you go back to Brundtland, the Brundtland report, then I think another criticism that has come out of the environmental humanities is its implied anthropocentrism, perhaps. Because when you look at that, it's about ensuring a good life for the current generation, while also doing that for the next generation or next generations of humans. But it's kind of focused on humans and not so much on other species or on the value of the environment itself, ecological processes themselves. So I think, those are at least two things, that have been criticized, and there are more. I'd be happy to add to that, but maybe Dan, you want to jump in at that point?
Yeah, well, I think that you raise just a really vital point, and it's one of at least two, I hope, productive tensions that exist in our interdisciplinary field. One, certainly between critique and then between critique and some kind of a productive or constructive novelty. In other words, we're really good in the humanities at asking questions, right? We're the ones at the table who are always like, well, what about the foundational ideas behind that? And that's good. That's vital. That's necessary. It's what we do very well, I think. But figuring out then, well, what now, right? What should we do next is another vital part of this. And I think that's one productive tension that exists within the environmental humanities. And well, I'll leave it at that. I think that you've identified really a kind of a critical, pivotal concept. We'll stop there.
One thing that comes to mind along these lines too is the whole issue of social inequality in the environmental movement. There's social inequality everywhere, and it seems to be in environmentalism as well. And as you well know, we all well know, the movement is often accused of being elitist, primarily white, right? Primarily middle or upper middle class. It's gotten that reputation, not necessarily fully justified, but it's certainly there. And so I think the field has to struggle with that too, like anthropology has had to struggle with notions of imposing values on others, that sort of thing. Maybe we can talk about that as we go along as well. This whole issue of, who actually pays for this, the sustainability when somebody has to pay, right? It have to be sacrifices. Who are the ones who are sacrificing, when and how much? Those are real questions, and they find their way into the literature on these issues, right? I mean, you find them in literary studies. So that's another thing perhaps we can look into.
Yeah, well, and I think that question of sacrifice, right? Where did that come from? Mm-hmm. Should that be something that is in fact a necessary part of things? An argument against that might be, well, does it need to involve sacrifice? Is it always a constant trade-off, right? Or can there be win-win solutions? Can there be ways in which we find that we can empower individual communities at the same time as we're also protecting the non-human world? And so part of what is, I think, good about our critique in the environmental humanities is this constant self-reflection about our terms and the source of those terms. It's easy to look, for instance, back at some of this literature from the 1970s with regard to sustainability and see the emergence of this idea of sacrifice that comes out of questions of resource availability, for instance. But there are other times when we see the limits of that kind of approach. And in fact, talking about sacrifice also may not have a very practical effect, that in fact it may turn people away from what could be very effective forms of creating a more sustainable world. And so, I think that tension also is I didn't want to get too off track before. There's the other kind of productive tension in the humanities between a kind of reflection and an action, the desire to think carefully about our terminology, but then also to create some sort of new thing. And a more activist sort of approach. And so a lot of the roots of this field are driven from a desire to make positive change in our world. But at the same time, we want to be careful about, well, where is this change coming from? Are we finding its roots in sort of Thoreauvian rhetoric? Are we finding its roots in United Nations reports? Are we finding it in someplace else? And so being able to do both those things at the same time is also a really important part of what it is we're doing.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point, this tension between reflection and activism. I think that a lot of eco-critics have. So eco-critics, again, you mentioned it earlier, Dan, but it is the study of environmental texts from the perspective of literary theory, literary studies, film studies, cultural studies. So in the widest sense, literary texts. And I think one thing that we have struggled with is this tension between critical reflection and taking things apart and criticizing them and historicizing them and all these, I think, very important things, but then also to get to the point where it's about the action, right? Where it's about contributing to the discussion, because that has also been a complaint that people working in the environmental humanities are not necessarily always the people who are being asked to join at the table, right? When it's about societal change and societal strategies, political strategies, it's not, they're not usually, they will not call the eco-critic first.
Right.
I think, to just put it mildly. So I do think that's a very important issue that I think in the past few years, a number of people have really grappled with, I would include myself in that group, and then I guess you too, that really are thinking about that tension between that reflection and the action. I also think that what Dan just talked about shows you how it's not only that, you know, from the perspective of the environmental humanities, there's kind of a critical view on that concept of sustainability, but it's also that discussions around sustainability in other fields have influenced us as cultural critics. You know, you mentioned social justice. You both actually mentioned that, or we could include that environmental justice, because that has been an issue. David, you mentioned that earlier, right? The perceived or actual whiteness of much of environmentalism or elitism in certain parts of the world, at least, and the tension with that has been there traditionally with activists in environmental justice movements, right? Who were often from different social classes, from different communities. And I think, Dan, correct me if I'm wrong there, but there has been a lot more integration of that in past years, certainly within ecocriticism, but I also think more generally, actually beyond even just the humanities, there has been an awareness we have learned, I guess, from that we need to change our understanding, not only of terms and concepts, but also of certain literatures, of certain literary heroes, cultural heroes, that we have to look at certain cultural traditions in a different way, right? I think that is something we've learned too.
And I think two really good examples of that just were published this past year were Rebecca Solnitz's discussion of John Muir that appeared in Sierra Magazine, and then Drew Lanham's really smart piece on John James Audubon, appeared in Audubon. So both here are two sort of environmental heroes, right, that have agency across disciplines. They're literary, they involve images. The environmental historians are interested in them, and certainly environmental activists too. They both are the foundations. One actively founded the Sierra Club, the other was the inspiration for the formation of the Audubon Society. And in both of these cases, we had a smart, incredibly thoughtful, both generous and critical pieces on these individuals, and pointing out, in Muir's case, his just blindness to the fact that not just Yosemite National Park, but every national park in the United States was created from indigenous land, and what that means, and why that matters, that we remember that. And it's not a question of sort of canceling John Muir or canceling John James Audubon, but it is a question of we need to be additive and make sure that other voices are at the table. And then we do have to be critical, because these blind spots or deliberate, deliberately sort of obscurance that occurs in these writings are important. That it does matter that we get that argument right. And for a long time, we might have pointed to those individuals as kind of environmental heroes. That look, Muir helped us to see, for instance, the beauty and the kind of religious or spiritual value of wild spaces. And Audubon certainly made us understand and be aware of the significance of birds and the various bird species, and through his writings as well as through his illustrations, the specificity that we need to understand other species. And so those are good things. But at the same time, when we have Audubon, who has a very troubled relationship with passing, with slaveholding, these are also things that we need to be aware of. And so to what they remind us is the ways in which paying attention to social justice concerns is not simply a thing that we need to sort of add to the group of ideas that we already have, but they need to be deeply integrated into what we do as scholars as well as activists.
Yeah, if I can tag on to that, I think, what this is in part also about is about storytelling that you mentioned at the very beginning. And I think there has been a lot more recognition in recent years outside the environmental humanities as well, how important storytelling is for how humans interact, for how humans imagine the future, for all these things. And there has been a recognition that if you want to become a more sustainable societies, if you want to walk into a more sustainable future than the path we're currently on, that storytelling somehow does play a role in that, and that people who know about storytelling, that may be a contribution of ecocriticism perhaps specifically, but in environmental history does this in a very different way, but they're definitely also very much interested in storytelling. And so I think that is an important point, and what the examples that Dan just gave us also tell you with Muir and Audubon how that connection between telling a story and then creating something in the real world, like national parks, or an interest in birds. So it's not like you just tell a story and that's disconnected, but these are also very good examples of how storytelling and activism and social change, in whatever way, and how flawed maybe, as you also pointed out, how that is interconnected, and why storytelling is not just a pastime. I was once told, I'm going to share this now, I'm not going to name names, but I once was told by an environmental historian, so that you can talk about methods and all that too if you want, that you're doing somewhat similar things, only that environmental historian is concerned with the real world and I'm just concerned with the fiction. So I'm not actually doing anything with the real world, which, I objected to because I think that is intertwined, and storytelling is one way that we have to communicate about the real world and to influence people about the real world. And there are plenty of examples how that can happen. I am personally at this point also interested in, doing some empirical research, like how actual people react to actual environmental stories. And so I think one thing I learned from that is that it tends to be a lot more complicated than you think. Okay? People's responses are very rarely, just like, oh, this is in the story and this is what everybody's going to take away from it. These ideas about manipulation and all that. It tends to be a lot more complicated. It's not like it doesn't matter at all what's in the story, but it seems to be that different audiences, different individual viewers, that they bring, we know this by now, they bring something to the story as well. And out of that process emerges some kind of new understanding. And my understanding so far has been that some of it maybe is what I would have expected, and some of it is utterly unexpected. And depending on the audience, and I would have never thought that people might take this away from a text. And I think that is fascinating as well.
Yeah, and your work, Alexa, I think is a great example of the ways in which this has to be interdisciplinary, because in storytelling, we might have traditionally talked about plot and implotment and how a story is crafted and what's put in and what's left out, or characters and so on. But you've brought in this notion of affect and affect studies into our understanding of it. And what I think what makes that such an important addition is that it speaks not only to the power of the story to transform an individual or not, right? Or in which ways, but also then the fact that stories matter because we have cultural stories that we tell. We have stories in common. And part of the question about sustainability is at what level do we make modifications? And so some have said longstanding belief in environmental studies that, well, if we can just change individuals, right? If we can get people to think differently, then they'll behave differently. And we pretty much now know that's not going to happen. Too often we behave in ways that are, let's say, more than rational. right? We do things for a whole bunch of different reasons, and it's difficult for us to change our behaviors, no matter, even if we know what we are doing isn't exactly ideal. And so we have to change systems, right? We have to change cultural frameworks. We have to change cultural assumptions. And then the question becomes, well, how do you do that? That's a tough one. Sometimes it's through just using the levers of power and making sure that the right people who are in power are understanding what needs to be changed. But sometimes it happens by changing whole kind of cultural attitudes about things. And we've seen that even in the last year here in the US as happening, and how quickly that can happen. But I think a big part of that, and this is where your work comes in, is because of the emotional component, because of having acknowledging the ways in which we are reacting, not simply to facts and figures, but to the power of stories through our bodily responses, the way that our bodies as features of the environment are responding in particular ways to those stories. So, this is really just a shout out to you, Alexa, to say that, that idea of affective environments has been a huge contribution. Maybe you could take just a few minutes for people unfamiliar with it to share, how, why you got into that aspect of this work and the reaction that people have had to it.
Sure, of course. Well, the funny thing is that the way I came to that is actually because, as David mentioned in the introduction, I was actually working in film and television as a scriptwriter before I even became an academic. For a long time, I've written over 100 scripts. And so that perspective, where it's all about, how do we get people emotionally? How do we get them involved? It's like it's like common knowledge. You have to get people's emotions, or the story is not going to work. At least in audiovisual context, this is what people talk about a lot. And then I guess the next step for me then, once I became an academic, was that I found this whole work of cognitive psychology that I found really fascinating in that context. And so I started looking into how do people actually respond to a text, right? And or film. That's fascinating research by psychologists, by neuroscientists about how the brain processes that, the role of the emotion system in that. And so that's why my work has become very interdisciplinary. First, my most recent book is about drawing on that knowledge to make them theoretical and analytical assumptions about texts. And my most recent work is collaborating with cognitive psychologists, and that's really interdisciplinary work. And as I said, the results can be very surprising. And one thing, as Dan has already pointed out, is that one thing that we learned is that it's not, we inform people. For example, that was the approach with climate change for a while. We just need to make everybody, it was about awareness raising, right? We need to communicate. It was about science communication, making people aware. And to some degree, I guess, the assumption was once people are aware and know what's going on and understand the science, they're going to change. That didn't really work well. And then I guess the next step is to say, no, we need storytelling. We need to get people by their emotions, right. Which I think, is not completely untrue. We have also found that, though, that people's emotions about something do not necessarily translate in different behavior. So that also is not that isn't as easy either. It's just very complex and more complex than I would have hoped, or maybe it's a good thing, right? Because otherwise we have in this whole conversation about manipulation again. So I think it's a good thing that people are actually reacting in complex ways, and it depends a lot on cultural background, on individual background, and so on and so forth. It's a give and take between a text and between a recipient. And these cultural stories, Dan, just that you mentioned, I think this larger cultural story, cultural memory, whatever you want to call that, I absolutely agree that, this is something that's really important there as well.
Mm-hmm. And this has been going on for a long time. Alexa, you must know there's a an exhibition called Human-Nature Relations in German Literature, curated by Sabine Wilke, that goes way into the 19th century and looks at how novelists and storytellers have affected ideas about the environment and about nature. So this is an old story. And when I looked at that, I was very impressed, first by the work that was done, but also by the fact that there have been practical effects of storytelling in the past on, at least in Germany, on attitudes toward rivers, for example, and dams and matters of that sort. Are you familiar with that exhibition?
Yes, I am. I'm familiar with Sabine's work. Yes, yeah, very fascinating.
Yes. It's
you know,
getting
and
around.
Alexa, you mentioned something that I think is really critical as we consider the way that this field has developed and emerged, and that is collaboration, right? That this is work that there was a day when we could all just sit in our library carrels and study our texts or look at our historical documentation and produce our articles, and that was it. That's all we had to do. And there's a sort of joy to that, of course. But the real joy for me, I think is as part of what's changed this field is collaboration, and to recognize the ways in which, like, you can't do your work without understanding what the psychological literature is. And yes, you can read about that, but how much more fulfilling to actually talk to people who are engaged in doing that research right now, and maybe involve them in your work. And I think that is absolutely, that's driven a lot of what makes the environmental humanities such an exciting field. So if you look globally, we see centers like the Rachel Carson Center in Germany. We see people collaborating across environmental history organizations to create the International Consortium of Environmental History Organizations. You see people who are talking, who might otherwise be focused on just literary studies, to try to understand, well, what are the historical roots of that, by having literary folks and environmental historians talk to one another and collaborate on things. And some of the most exciting things for me that come out of these centers and institutes and initiatives are, in fact, digitally native things. So we can find lots of examples of online resources now, which are wonderful for teaching, which are wonderful for public outreach, and that are also developments that can shape scholarship in important ways. So whether it's something like the digital online exhibit about a silent spring, that was one of the first that the Rachel Carson Center put together, and it's just incredibly rich archive of images and information and timelines and historical, a context for that book, which is, again, it's a great teaching tool, but it also helps us to understand that book from the perspective of research and what how we might better approach it. That's one example. Another more recent example is the Feral Atlas that's now online, that goes through Stanford, and a way in which it tries to show the entanglement of human and non-human species, and to see this sort of multi-species world developing. And so the way that through collaboration and through harnessing a lot of these digital tools, we can really do what we're supposed to do at universities, which is create new knowledge. That's, to me, one of the most exciting things about this area of study.
We do have a question on the chat board I'd like to raise. Concerns both of you. Comes from Joni Brigham, and she wants to know what you think about the role of storytelling in social norming as a driver of behavior. Read the literature that shows how central social norms are to behavioral change. So how does norming as a driver of behavior work? You have any thoughts about that?
Certainly a good question, and maybe I'll let Alexa think some about it. The example that I always turn to is, I had a environmental psychologist come and speak to one of my classes, and her part of what she was discussing was about social norming for environmental issues. And she was a guest lecturer, and she came in and she was holding her bicycle helmet. And she got her stuff together and put her bicycle helmet down and started to talk about psychology. And then in the middle of her talk said, so I've just shown you an example of this psychological principle of social norming. The more people that you see walk in holding a bicycle helmet, the more this becomes normalized, right? It doesn't become this weird thing that a small handful of people are doing, right? Two-wheel transportation, then this is very much a US phenomenon, right? This is already a social norm in much of Europe. But here, it's not necessarily as much of a social norm. And so absolutely, I think that storytelling can help to further that kind of social norming. It can do it in positive ways. There are also ways in which it might drive social norms in directions that aren't as helpful. So we see this a lot in the literature about climate change, in which some of the new norms seem to be apocalyptic scenarios, right? And you get enough of those now in films and in fiction that we start to think, oh, that's the norm, right? That's going to be our future. We're now living through a disastrous future. There are other, of course, stories that become more hopeful. And some of the most interesting stories are the ones that do both of those at the same time, right? And see the ways in which transformations, positive social transformations, can come out of really difficult scenarios. So I think that storytelling is crucial for that kind of social norming, but I don't think it's a single line that happens. Again, I don't think, art doesn't work that way. Art doesn't work in a sort of, I'm going to write this story and then therefore you're going to behave in this way. It's a much more varied process than that. So Alexa, do you have any thoughts on social norming?
Absolutely. I mean, I agree. It's definitely that it's never, it's always complicated and complex in the sense that there are competing, there are always going to be competing stories. But nevertheless, if you think about something, especially if you think about popular culture, I think that's particularly interesting there. If you just think about something simple, how many people used to smoke in movies, in American movies, and how many people smoke now in American movies, right? And depending on when they're set. So if you have a movie set in, a contemporary setting, then probably very few people will smoke. And even if today a film is shot that's set back in time, then people will smoke. But I think that is a simple example of how people stop smoking somehow in film, and I think that works also for other things, and it could potentially, of course, work for environmental issues. So this was a health issue, I guess, arguably an environmental issue as well. But for example, there is an initiative that I'm aware of in Hollywood. This is the Redford Center is one of the drivers behind that, to create new stories, new content, especially for streaming services, but also cinematic released movies and television that do engage with climate change, not in an apocalyptic or dystopian way, but instead making it the background, if you will, making it part of the life world of characters in stories that are about something else, just making it part of the life world without this being set in the future or anything. And there are active calls for that, because some people at least are fed up with what they perceive as a too narrow focus on the dystopian, as you mentioned there, right? And I think there's a place for the dystopian, and there are now also a lot of calls for utopian storytelling. It's more about resilience and hope and all that. But I thought that was interesting as well, that the storytelling is actually neither utopian nor dystopian, but more talking about how climate change actually becomes part of each in every story at this point, because it's becoming our normality, right? And I think that is a very interesting, that they're actively looking for stories that do that, right, as an initiative.
I think that idea of storytelling and creating a sort of new normal can be connected to this idea of the apocalypse. And so one of the more interesting books that I've come across recently is Catherine Yusuf's A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None. And so this book is about the ways in which it's one of many critiques of the idea of the Anthropocene, or that there is this new moment in human history that can be found in the geological record, probably related to the Trinity test and the rise of the nuclear era. And so that we can find this moment in the geological record, and that there's this new age of human domination. And part of the imagery that accompanies a lot of that is that it's apocalyptic. We recognize that the Anthropocene, this is not necessarily going to lead to a utopia. And what Catherine Yusof does is talks about the ways in which this, I mean, there are multiple critiques of the idea, but one of them is that, well, the apocalypse, if you're a member of an indigenous community in North America, the apocalypse has been going on for a much longer time than just the 1950s, right? And so this idea of apocalypse is very much one that comes out of a Western scientific framework. And she investigates it even further and says, and we can look at geology, this seemingly value-free science, and point to the ways in which geology as a science, in some ways, has been involved in the process of colonization, has enabled the technologies that have created the world in which we now live, and have created the possibility of, and in some cases, specific examples of injustice. And so it's this great, it's both theoretically sophisticated and at the same time, I think, powerfully persuasive argument about how a term that seems to have been one of a handful of terms that have developed to help us understand this moment is itself highly problematic. And so it's a work of scholarship, but it also has this activist component to it, which says, and therefore we need to be much more careful when we use that term. And and this can create a more socially just society if we use different language and talk about it differently. So, it's going to be hard to make that into a movie, but nevertheless, does really important work. And so it's one of many examples of thought-provoking scholarship that's coming out of the environmental humanities that can really change the way we all think and the way we all speak about these issues.
Yeah, and to come back to this idea of the catastrophe, I mean, to point here to Austria, to Vienna, Eva Hahn has written about this, in a big book about the future as catastrophe, and how it has been framed like that, and what kind of work that does politically and emotionally. That, one of our arguments is that this allows us to access somehow a future that's kind of threatening, or that it's a future of risk, and we're vaguely afraid of it. And I guess perhaps younger generations even more so. And her argument is that, at least in a Western context, that this tradition allows us to imagine that, and then once we have imagined it, once it is in front of us in the form of a movie, of a apocalyptic or kind of disaster movie or other narrative, doesn't have to be a movie, that this allows us to kind of work through that. So I think that is definitely perhaps part of why these stories have been so popular. And Eva Hahn is also, the more recent work is on the Anthropocene, which you've mentioned. And I think the argument there is that she has made with Hannes Bergthaler is that it's kind of a rupture that as humanities scholars, as environmental humanities scholars and beyond, it forces us to many of the things that we've talked about now, because there is this fear of some sort of apocalypse, some sort of what might be in store for us. And the argument that they make in the book is that forces us to kind of get out of our comfort zone, as Dan earlier said, to collaborate, to talk to the public, to do more public outreach, to all of these things that they, for them, it's kind of this understanding that we are in you could also call it an era of risk, if you want, that we are understanding that, and that kind of drives us, forces us almost to do the kind of work that, in part at least, also the environmental humanities trying to contribute currently.
Let me just jump in here quickly. Say we don't have a lot of time left, so I would like to ask any of you in the audience, if you've got questions, and I hope you do, please put them on the chartboard so that we can see them and I can see them, and we can address those then to our two panelists. So again, if you've got any questions, oh, here's one that just came up from Christine Marin. How much scientific knowledge should a good humanist have under their belt in order to, I guess, to have this practical, you know, you got to have your chops, I think, to some degree, in fields of biology or you know, environmental studies. I mean, that's very important. And so that's the quote. What about this notion that a good humanist scholar has to have some pretty strong credentials in the sciences, say, for example?
That's just such a great question. Thanks, Christine. And I think that you know, it's when the field of literature and environment first began, and people were trying to provide advice, that was one bit of advice that a lot of people gave was, you know, well, what is that? You're studying environmental literature. Well, you need to study biology and you need to study ecology. And it's like, well, how much time do I have?
Yeah, exactly.
It's not possible for any of us to become experts in multiple, well, it is possible, I suppose, if all you want to do is get PhDs. But for the most part, the question is, you know, what is necessary to do your project? That's one of the great things that came out of the development of cultural studies as a field. It was to say, what tools do you need to do this project effectively? And I think that a good way into answering the question is to recognize the value of materiality as another important theme that's you know, developed in and through the environmental humanities, as well as in other fields, of course, but recognizing that to do good work in this area, we need to pay attention to the agency of the non-human world. So Alexa earlier talked about stories that are non-anthropocentric. And I mentioned, you know, multi-species narratives. So to be able to do that effectively and accurately, you do have to know something about the non-human world. I was just, you know, I've been teaching Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac recently, which I hadn't taught for a number of years. And I was impressed anew and again with how much Leopold just knew of his environment in Sand County, Wisconsin, and how little we know of our own environments. And that in order to understand the power of that book, we really do have to understand quite a bit about the place in which Leopold found himself. And so I think to have at least some knowledge of prairie ecosystems, for instance, or of what ecological restoration involves and what some of the debates in the field are now, can help us to understand, for instance, what Leopold was saying, to understand the land ethic, and as a result, maybe be better at what we're doing now in terms of our practice of environmental restoration or our valuation of wildness, for instance. So there's no like, you need to spend 25% of your time learning ecological restoration answer here, but there is the answer that if we come into it ignorant of the actual debates that are happening in the actual scientific fields, our scholarship, our work, our teaching will be so much the lesser as a result of it.
Of course, by the same token, you want to have the scientists reading literature as well. You know, it goes both ways, right? As one of the questioners pointed out. I mean, if this is going to be truly interdisciplinary and cooperative, then you've got to have both the scientific community and, if you will, the literary community, the humanistic community working together. I mean, that's clearly important. With one quick question for you then, Alexa, you're probably familiar with the Austrians. You know, there's a program there. It's an EU-funded thing called New Financing Instruments for Sustainability. Do you know about that in Austria? And I was wondering if
no, I don't.
On that. It's a program funded by the EU. It's called New Financing Instruments for Sustainable Energy in Austria. And I looked at their brochure and it looked like it was written by semi-literate scientists, I have to say. And it was a little, I mean, I'm
glad you said that, not me.
Yeah, I know. I should be a little more careful with my choice of words.
There were scientists who were specialists in their area.
Yeah,
I think that's how you wanted to phrase it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Anyway, yeah,
Yeah,
obviously cooperation. Go ahead, Sabina.
Well, and I also wanted to add, to that earlier question, because I think I totally agree with Dan. And it's a challenge. It's always a challenge of how much do you need to know? How deeply can you go into, whatever you're investigating currently? But I would absolutely agree. You have to make a real effort. It involves some knowledge, some interest in ecology and biology and whatever your topic is. This was a very big challenge for me because I also do something else. I also draw on knowledge in neuroscience and in cognitive psychology, and I'm not trained in that. And so that means understanding, for me, you have to learn some of that language. You have to learn some of that methodology. You have to, go be there, talk to people, work with them to some degree. And then at some point it means collaboration, because the work that I'm currently doing and that colleagues of mine like Wojciech Małecki in Poland, Matthew Schneider-Meyerson in Singapore, and others, Scott Slovic in the US, that we're doing, that you have to bring in the different expertise, because I cannot run an fMRI machine, or I cannot run a quantitative experiment. I cannot do the statistical analysis, but then I can help, with finding the text we are going to look at, and analyze that text and help design the questionnaire. All of these things I can do in collaboration. And there you really need people from both sides who are willing to do that. And that's not always easy, because the methodologies are very different. You need to learn that the questions that you ask are very different, and that you have to adjust the questions that you ask, that you have to find like a compromise, like a middle ground where both sides can do something actually and get something out of it. David, what you asked about the literateness of scientists, I think there are more and more people who actually are willing to do that. That's my experience.
I think so too.
And it's on both sides again, because literary scholars, humanities scholars also have been unwilling to engage with empirical research, for example. Right? And there's much more collaboration now, and more appreciation for the other side. And you have to find your partners. You have to find people who are like-minded, who are willing to do this kind of difficult, work in the middle ground. Yeah.
Absolutely. Any more questions out there? We're really coming pretty close to the end of our time here. I don't see any more on the chat board, but we have a couple more minutes if anybody wants to raise a quick question in conclusion. I certainly welcome that.
And while people are thinking and hopefully writing, I'll just add that I've found, even though sometimes you hear kind of antagonistic rhetoric about the sciences and the humanities, I've really never experienced much of that in practice.
That's good.
But I usually find my colleagues in the sciences are just delighted when humanists are expressing interest in their work, and are usually very eager to hear about, what we're doing. And so this sort of CP Snow 2 cultures thing has been around for a really long time. And while I appreciate the sort of intent of it, I think that I find it more really not very effective in terms of actual practice. And on the ground, it seems as if, there's a great desire for collaboration. And if anything, it's just the reason it doesn't happen more often is just a lack of time. It's hard for scientists to find the time to participate in these things. It's hard for those of us in the humanities with all of our advising and teaching and research requirements.
And sometimes also funding, right? Depending on the type of research. So these things, it's often practical things as well.
Here in the States, the National Science Foundation has increasingly asked for this kind of collaboration, and has said, we really want to see this sort of work happening. And the same thing is coming from the National Endowment for the Humanities. So those are really great things to see happening.
So there is hope out there. I think, speaking of time, we're about out of it. But I do want to thank both of you for incredibly interesting discussion and very profitable. There's no question that we're going to have to work together on all of this, and it's going to be tough. We have a bill now, before Congress having to do with climate change as part of the mix, and it's gotten a lot of blowback, from people who say, well, it'll take us back to the Stone Age, and a bunch of Luddites are trying to crimp our style of life and this sort of stuff. So we have to get beyond those things, and storytelling is one of the ways to do it. And work like you two are doing, that's certainly one of the ways to do it. So much appreciate your helping out with all of this. I think it was a great discussion. And there'll be discussion further on about the Alps, and that'll be very interesting because that's an ecosystem that's been under threat, and it's a very lively place where all kinds of new ideas are coming about. So I think we'll have to close it with that. Again, thanks to all of you for joining us, and thanks to the two panelists for a brilliant discussion.